The Wendall Bank Case by Guy Clifford. I believe few professions see so much of the seamy side of life as do solicitors in active practice. Some clergymen in the poorest and lowest districts of our great cities are no doubt oftener brought in contact with the sufferers from keen poverty and its contaminants, drink and debauchery. But this class is only one of many that comes under the heading I have in mind. The medical brotherhood, too, have curious and saddening experience amongst the poorer patients, but to the lawyer is opened out a larger field, embracing all sorts of conditions of men, from the most wretched pilferer to the high-class rogue. The peculiar case which has brought these thoughts uppermost in my mind may be recognized by some who peruse the story, but in order to avoid unnecessary pain, I shall omit the real names of the chief actors in these scenes. Among our most lucrative and esteemed clients was Josiah Wendall, the head of a well-known firm of private bankers of Wendall, Holmes and Company. When Mr. Wendall walked into my room early one morning, some years ago, I noticed immediately that some matter of serious importance was troubling him. There was no jovial salutation, as was his wont, but instead his face bore the impression of grief and sorrow. Without preamble he commenced, as he sat down by my side. "Mr. Walton, I am sorely upset and want your advice. Not so much professionally as privately, as a friend." I expressed my sympathy in a few words and waited for him to proceed. Mr. Wendall was a rich man, and his affairs, I had ample knowledge of knowing, were prosperous and thriving, so I did not attribute his worry to any money matters. "I scarcely know how to commence," began Mr. Wendall, "for my story inculpates without a shadow of a doubt one whom I have always looked upon as a soul of honor, and who is endeared to me as much of his own good qualities as also for his father's sake. Even now, with every circumstance pointing to his guilt, I cannot believe him criminal. However, I will give you the facts so far as they are known, and then, perhaps, we may find some opening to work with. You're aware, Mr. Halton, that my nephew, Frank Wendall, holds the responsible position of chief cashier in our bank." I signified my assent to the question, and he continued. "Now, as such, he has the right to enter the safe room during business hours. This right is also enjoyed by the manager and myself and my partner Holmes, and no one else is ever permitted to go into that room save the 4 persons I have just named. As it happens, the manager is away on his holiday, and before he left Saturday, the cash, notes, and other securities were checked, and all were correct, so that we can leave him out of the affair, which is now narrowed down to 3 persons. Yesterday, after the doors were closed, my books were made up, and the cash and notes checked in the usual way, when it was discovered that £3,000 in notes were missing." "Excuse me a moment," I interrupted, "but are they still unaccounted for?" My client seemed rather surprised at the question, for he answered somewhat evasively, "Yes, of course, or I shouldn't have been troubling you." At his reply, I rang my bell and desired the clerk who answered it to ask my partner, Robert Graceman, to come to my room if he was in. While he was gone with his message, I explained to Mr. Wendall that I thought Mr. Graceman's advice on such a serious matter would be far more valuable than mine. While I was speaking, Graceman came in, and these 2 old friends greeted each other warmly. "How's my little godchild Trixie?" asked Robert Graceman. The smile of welcome passed away from Mr. Wendell's brow at the question, and he replied gravely, "I'm afraid, Graceman, that the news you will soon have to hear will break her heart." Beatrice, or Trixie as she was just called, was Josiah Wendell's only child, and the apple of his eye. The fact that my partner, Robert Graceman, had stood godfather over her shows the terms of friendship which had existed between the two men for many years. At the serious and, to ask him, strange reply of his friend, Graceman turned to me with the remark, "What's the matter?" "Tell him, Halton," said Mr. Wendell. So I repeated, shortly and as concisely as possible, the opening incidents I had just heard. As the elucidation of the disappearance of the notes and the final result of the affair passed hereafter through Graceman's hands, I set down the rest of the story and narrative as the various details were unraveled. "What has all this got to do with Trixie?" asked Graceman. "Although I have no authority in saying so beyond my own common sense tells me, yet I am sure that Frank and Trixie look upon each other with more affection than their cousinly relationship might justify," replied Mr. Wendell. "What does Frank say to the loss of the notes?" was Graceman's next inquiry. "He can give no explanation. He is as much in the dark as the rest of us," replied Frank's uncle. "When the loss was discovered, and it was first naturally assumed to be a mistake in the counting, but after repeatedly checking no alteration could be made, and Frank sent one of the clerks up to my house, for whilst he remained with those of the clerks who had been engaged with him. When I received his message, I hurried back to the bank, and we had all the business done since the last checking gone through. But still there remained the unaccountable discrepancy of £3,000. Frank then suggested we should examine the contents of the safe and hope that the packet of notes might have fallen down somewhere, so he and a couple of the other clerks emptied the room whilst I looked on. As each bag of corn or package with notes was returned, they were carefully and anxiously scanned, but we had our trouble for nothing. No one could suggest anything further. We locked up for the night, leaving the watchman in charge." "This is a bad business, Wendell," he began. "A very bad business." Now, Holmes, as a rule, is an easygoing fellow. In fact, too easygoing, as I have sometimes hinted to him. But it struck me somehow that there was more feeling in his words than the occasion at present called for. I suppose my surprise at his manner showed itself, for he went on. "It appears that the books and cash were checking over and over again last night, and the £3,000 is still missing. Well, notes don't walk away by themselves, and unless someone broke into the safe room, of which there is no appearance or suggestion, they must have been, well, to speak plainly, stolen." It was speaking plainly with a vengeance, yet still there was no other way to accounting for their loss. Then he continued, "This cannot be hushed up, for it affects the heads of the bank too seriously, for there are only 3 people who have free entrance to the safe room, you, myself, and your nephew Frank Wendall. Under the circumstances, I'm sure you will agree with me that the fullest investigation only will suffice, and the sooner the matter is put into the proper hands, the better for all of us." For a few moments I pondered over what Holmes had so clearly reasoned, and I could find no fault in his arguments. Somehow I felt that Frank was not the culprit, and if this were so, there remains but Holmes and myself, and I should soon expect to be charged with the theft myself, as dream of suspecting Holmes. Altogether, Holmes says, it's very unpleasant business. "Have you called anyone into the investigation?" asked Graceman. No, I suggested to Holmes that I should ask your advice as to what we should do, and he consented immediately on consulting you. For a few seconds, Graceman remained in thought. Then he said, I quite agree with Mr. Holmes that the matter should be gone into without further delay, and if you consent, I will send a note up to Scotland Yard at once and put the affair into Inspector Layman's hands. He is a cautious, careful man, and you don't want the matter made more public at present than can be helped. Meantime, I should advise you to call your official accountants and have your books authentically audited so that you can make absolutely sure that there is no other way of explaining the loss. So Mr. Wendall went back to his bank, and a note was sent up to the Inspector Layman by special messenger, and in due time that official came down to her office. After he and Graceman had discussed the matter of the facts so that they had so far, they went together around to the bank. I am very glad to meet you, Mr. Graceman, said Mr. Holmes when they entered. My opinion is that the sooner the affair of this kind is put into the proper hands, the better for everyone. Then they proceeded to the safe room to see themselves where the notes were stolen from, and Inspector Layman minutely examined the lock for evidence of tampering. There was no indication, however small, to show that the safe had been forced, so after a short while they met again in the partner's private room. Safe has not been broken into, gentlemen, remarked the officer authoritatively, and then he proceeded. I understand that only two gentlemen, looking alternatively between Mr. Wendall and his partner, and your chief inspector, and your chief cashier, Mr. Frank Wendall, were allowed to enter the safe room. Yes, that is so, answered Mr. Wendall. Is it impossible for either of the other clerks to enter the safe? Asked Mr. Layman. Mr. Holmes glanced at his partner, who returned the look of inquiry when the former replied, It is not possible to enter it, and I believe it would be impossible for others of the clerks or anyone else to enter without being observed. And that is really what you meant? Yes, sir, that is my meaning, answered the inspector. But how do you arrange that no one can enter unseen? Is there always someone watching the safe? Let me explain, said Mr. Holmes. You saw that the safe stood apart from clear of the clerk's desks, with a large space between it and the nearest desk. Mr. Layman answered with the affirmative, and Mr. Holmes then continued. Our strictest injunction and most sternly enforced rule is that no clerk shall approach or enter the safe room unless specifically requested, and is accompanied by one of the partners, the manager, or the chief cashier. The penalty of this breach of the rule is instant dismissal, without appeal. Another rule, equally stringent, obliges any clerk or any other official to report at once anyone infringing on this rule, and to call the attention of those in the office to the offender, to corroborate his breach with those regulations. The desks facing the safe room set 20 clerks, and I would say that it would be absolutely impossible for anyone to enter the safe without being observed. I quite endorse Mr. Holmes' opinion, added his partner. I do not believe the safe could be entered by anyone without being noticed. Very well, gentlemen, replied the inspector. You, of course, are aware that the only inference can be drawn from your opinions is that your chief cashier must have abstracted the notes, and I should like to have a few words with him if you will allow me to do so. Scarcely had the inspector formulated his wish ere Mr. Holmes rang his bell and requested Mr. Frank Wendall to be sent to them. You have a private room I can see him in? Asked the officer. Certainly, Mr. Holmes, he answered. And then Frank answered and said, This is Mr. Frank Wendall, Inspector Layman. Then turning to Frank, he continued, Your uncle and I have considered that it is advisable to transfer our personal responsibilities to the proper authority and this gentleman, waving his hand towards the officer. desires to have a few words with you. Take him into the next room." Inspector Lehman closed the door carefully and, approaching quite closely to Frank, said, "I presume we cannot be overheard in any way." "I think not," answered Frank rather shortly, for he did not quite appreciate the position. Circumstantial facts pointed very inflexibly at himself as a thief, and he knew that unless the notes were discovered, the odium and shame would surely rest on him, whether or not Mr. Holmes or his uncle charged him openly. Knowing himself innocent, he had hitherto refrained from supposing that the notes were stolen, for the simple reason that he hadn't taken them, and there were only two other persons who could, namely his uncle or Mr. Holmes, neither of whom, for the moment, had thought capable. Frank's notion was that by some strange mischance the notes had gotten mislaid. How or where he hadn't the slightest idea. All this had been carrying through his puzzled brain ever since the notes were proved to be gone. Inspector Lehman noticed the abruptness of Frank's reply and receded. "Do not consider me an enemy, Mr. Wendall, simply because I am an officer and have unpleasant questions." Frank reddened somewhat at the implied rebuke, and then, with his usual outspokenness, he said, "I beg your pardon, of course. You're only doing your duty. Now, fire away. Ask me anything you like. Meanwhile, pray sit down." And Frank drew a chair forward for the inspector, while he sat himself in a corner of the table. "First of all, can you give me the numbers of the missing notes?" said the inspector. Frank drew a slip of paper from his pocket and handed it to Mr. Lehman. It contained the numbers of the notes, which were all of the value of £10 each. "Good," replied the officer, as he glanced over the slip, and then added, "What is your opinion of the missing notes? Are they lost, mislaid, stolen, or what?" "At first, of course, I thought they were mislaid somehow, but that seems impossible now after the searches we have made. Then comes the question of theft and the thieves." And then Frank went over to the same rules that Mr. Holmes had previously enumerated. "So you see that if they were stolen, there are three possible thieves: myself, my uncle, and Mr. Holmes." "Have you any reason to think your uncle or Mr. Holmes guilty?" interrogated Mr. Lehman, holding up a warning finger as Frank sprang off the table. Frank choked down the hasty words of denial he was about to utter, and reseated himself in the corner and answered quietly, "No, not the slightest suspicion." Ejaculated the officer, looking squarely at Frank, who returned his gaze unflinching, and then added, "I don't know whether that home of yours was a question or not, but I may remark that I have not taken any notes." "I believe you, Mr. Wendell," answered the officer in a tone of sincerity. Then he said, "Now, for my last question, why does Mr. Holmes dislike you?" "Dislike me?" asked Frank in amazement. "I was not aware that he did. Certainly we have never been particularly cordial with each other, but he is a standoffish man with all the clerks. No, I think you're mistaken, Mr. Lehman." "Well, perhaps I am. No doubt it's only his manner." Rising from his seat, he thanked Frank for his confidence, and returned to the room where the partners and Graceman were still busy turning over the details of the loss. "Well?" asked Mr. Holmes interrogatively, as the detective entered. "Mr. Frank Wendell cannot account for the loss," the latter replied. "He practically confirms every point that you have admitted." "What do you propose now that be done?" asked Mr. Holmes. For a few moments the astute officer did not reply. Then he said, "I should like to consider the case for a short time, say until tomorrow morning. Then I will give you my opinion, that is, unless you prefer to charge your cashier with theft at once." "No, no," exclaimed Mr. Wendell. "Frank is no thief." "Very well, gentlemen. I will call in the morning." Mr. Graceman rose as the inspector bowed himself out. In a low tone, he said to the two partners, "I will go with him and hear what he thinks on the matters." As the lawyers and detective walked slowly away, Mr. Graceman opened the conversation abruptly with, "Is Frank Wendall the thief, Layman?" "I believe not," was the answer. "He is in a terribly bad hole. I suppose there's no doubt the notes were there." "They all say so," replied Mr. Graceman. Then he added, "Let me jot down the numbers of those notes." And the officer handed him the slip to the companion, which he rapidly copied and then required. "Now I must leave you, Layman," said Robert Graceman, as they reached the corner of the street. And then, as though it was an afterthought, he added that they should shake hands. "I'm rather interested in this little affair, and perhaps shall be able to offer you a few suggestions when the thoughts you riddle out. But then again, I may be working on the wrong scent. So you go ahead with your own deductions, and if I come across anything of importance, you shall hear from me." And so they parted. The detective officer returned to his office, and by breakfast time next morning had the reports and notes from several of his staff, who he had specifically detailed to glean information likely to help. Frank Wendell's private address had been watched, and his movements dogged during the past few hours. His uncle and Mr. Holmes had also shared a part of the careful inspector's attention, but so far nothing of importance had been unearthed by the bloodhounds of Scotland Yard. Frank had gone home to his rooms in Russell Square rather late than usual, having had another turn at the books at the bank. He had his dinner and then walked up Oxford Street to Hyde Park and entered his uncle's house, which he left about 10:30 and walked back to his lodgings. Mr. Wendell, Frank's uncle, had gone home direct from the bank early in the afternoon, and had not since left his house. Mr. Holmes, however, had dined with his club, visited one of the theaters, and caught the last train to Waterloo for Richmond, where he resided in a bachelor estate. "Precious little help to me here," muttered the detective as he threw down the various reports of the satellites. "I don't like Mr. Holmes," he soliloquized, "but that's mere prejudice, of course. There's no motive for his stealing the notes, unless... By George, I never thought of that." Mr. Layman hastily rose up and put on his hat and hurried out. The bank had just opened when the detective arrived, and Frank Wendell was busily engaging in opening and reading the ordinary business correspondence in his private room when the inspector was announced. "Early, Mr. Layman," remarked Frank, looking up. "Have you any good news?" His visitor shook his head negatively, but instead of answering the question, asked another. "Can you inform me if either your uncle or Mr. Holmes is pressed for money?" "No, don't get angry. There may be nothing in the inquiry. And if it is a breach of confidence, why, you can please yourself to answer no. But in the latter event, it would necessitate my finding out through other sources, which might be still less to the liking of the partners." Frank sat for a moment in his thoughts, rapidly examining the motive for the detective's question. The inspector saw his advantage and followed up in a masterly manner. "Don't forget, sir," he said quietly, "that I have been instructed to investigate this unfortunate affair, and that your position is seriously and gravely threatened if the missing notes are not soon discovered." "You shall see the accounts of my uncle and Mr. Holmes as they stand in the firm's ledger," Frank replied at last, and without further parley he went to the outer office and brought in the bank ledger. Turning up the account first to his uncle, there appeared a godly balance at the gentleman's credit. Then Mr. Holmes' account was found. "I thought he had more than that," muttered Frank, as the figures totted out to show only a few £100 balance. "Still, this is only his private account, and he appears to have been drawing on it pretty frequently lately. Perhaps he's investing it. I see a good many checks are payable to Scott & Son. Those are his stockholders." Yes, very likely, answered Mr. Lehman. And now, to complete my curiosity, let me see your account. As the detective made his demand, he glanced keenly at the young man by his side. Frank turned over the leaves rapidly and without hesitation pointed his finger to the columns which represented his own little account. Then he remarked with a smile, "I am sorry it's so small, but I rely on your reticence not to publish my poverty to the world." "You may rely on my treating your confidence with absolute secrecy," replied his companion, and then he bade him good morning, saying he should return to see his uncle later on. But his morning's work had not yet discovered any new feature of the tangled scheme which had been placed in his hands for solution, and when Inspector Lehman, a few hours later, presented himself before the two partners, he had practically nothing new to report. "We must wait until some of the stolen notes turn up," was his last remark as he left the room. "There's nothing to work on," mused the puzzled detective as he made his way thoughtfully towards the city, where he proposed to drop into the Bank of England on the off chance of finding some of the missing notes had been cashed. All of the banks in London and the country had been notified of the loss, with the numbers of the notes. There was no news of them yet, however, so Mr. Lehman hailed a hansom and got back to his official quarters to attend to other business. On the third day after his visit to the city, Inspector Lehman received a telegram just as he was leaving to get his frugal lunch. It was from Robert Graceman, and he was dispatched to the Royal Hotel Hall. The message was short, but the detective seemed thunderstruck at its contents. Then he read it through again. "Ring warrant for arrest of Charles Farnley, Wendall's manager, for the theft of £3,000 notes. It is detained here." "Well, he muttered. Early that night, Inspector Lehman arrived at Hull, and Mr. Graceman met him at the station. "Have you got your papers?" said Mr. Graceman, as they shook hands. Lehman nodded, and then he could hold his patience no longer. "How on earth did you trace it to him?" he exclaimed. "Where did you find your clue?" "Wait till we've got him safe under lock and key, then you can hear all the details," replied his companion, as they walked briskly towards the police station, which was only a few minutes away. Charles Farnley was detained on suspicion, and as soon as Inspector Lehman arrived with his warrants, the prisoner was transferred to the secure custody of a police cell. "Come on, Mr. Grayson," Lehman began, directly as they got back to the hotel, and had secured a quiet corner in the smoking room. "How did you get on his tail?" "Let me ask you first, Lehman," said Robert Graceman. "You were present when Mr. Frank Wendall checked the contents of the safe for our edification. Did you notice the method in which it was done?" The inspector looked at his questioner as though he could read from the latter's face what he was driving at. At last he slowly replied, "Yes, I believe I remember. Mr. Frank took the packages of notes and bags and coins from one clerk, who called out each, and glancing at them, placed them in the safe." "Quite so," replied Mr. Graceman approvingly. Then he continued, "Our friend here, Mr. Farnley, went through the operation on the previous checking just before he went away." "Yes," said the inspector, still in the dark. "Therefore, assuming that neither Mr. Wendall, the uncle, or Mr. Holmes, or Mr. Wendall, the nephew, had touched the notes since then, Mr. Farnley was the last person to do so." "Ah!" ejaculated the detective. "That set you to thinking about the manager." "Just so, and then I casually inquired where our friend had gone." Now, Scarborough, at this period of the year, was, so I thought, hardly a place for a man of Finley's lively temperament, for he's a bit of a masher in his way, and it is dead out of season for that lively seaside resort. I ascertained from Mr. Wendell, on a quiet, what hotel he was staying at, and as I knew you would attend the matters in London all right, I considered the air of Scarborough might do me some good. So I caught the afternoon train for that charming place. Then the hospitality exclaimed, and he proffered a cigar. Have another cigar. Yours is out. Thank you, replied Inspector Lehman, judiciously hiding his impatience to hear the rest of the story. Then Mr. Graceman continued. I was not surprised to find out when I arrived at the hotel that Mr. Farney was out. He had gone away for a few days, the clerk informed me politely, and he did not know where. The porter had carried his bag to the station, so I interviewed that individual and was fortunately able to discover his destination. I say fortunately, you may call it luck perhaps. He had sent a man with his bag to secure a corner seat in a smoking carriage while he bought his ticket, and then give the man a shilling for his services and jumped into a carriage. He had forgotten to get a paper, however, and called the porter back to give him a copper to buy one. In doing so, he pulled the ticket out of it, and it fell on the platform. The porter was an observant fellow and caught the name of the ticket. It was Hull. Thus you see the little things leading up the way it was. For that penny paper cost our mutual friend his liberty. Layman knew his friend too well to hurry him, but he fretted at the proximity of the narrative, so he nodded in appreciation and pretended to enjoy his cigar as he closed his eyes and waited patiently for his friend to continue. Hull, I thought, was still less attractive a place from Farnley's holiday, Mr. Graceman resumed, and I was so curious to find out what attraction drew him there that I followed at once. It was rather late when I arrived, so I left my investigation till the morning. Then I set out to try to trace the man. I was some time before I got on his tracks, and I discovered that he had taken the steamer on the previous day for Rotterdam. This was still a curious change of plans, so I followed him by that day's boat and cut the long story short. With the aid of the authorities, I soon discovered what he was up to. He had gone over to change the stolen notes, but we were too late to catch him before he had turned them into coin. The man had changed them, however, showed me the identical notes which he had changed for 10% commission. As I did not want any of the extradition trouble, I kept quiet and waited for the next steamer to sail for Hull. Just before the advertised time was started, arrived the man who came on board, and I knew that he was safe. When we arrived at Hull, I followed him to the hotel, and just then I called the chief inspector and charged him with the theft, and you know the rest. "You're splendid, simply splendid!" exclaimed the excited inspector when Graceman ended his story. Now I took it for granted that the notes were safe when the manager left, and never connected him with the notes at all. "That be bothered," replied the inspector. "There were the facts to see me and utilize, just the same as you saw them, but I could not see beyond my nose, while you read them correctly. The force lost a mighty leader when you took it to the law, sir." "Peru," replied Mr. Graceman, smiling at the officer's laudation. "You forget your own many successes." To say that all the bank was amazed at the turn of the events would be speaking mildly. Mr. Holmes had considered Frank Wendall's guilt as the next door to proved, and had hastened to offer the young cashier his sincere apologies for his doubts, which Frank met with his fullest manner, and therefore after their personal esteem grew and flourished. Frank's uncle was also delighted to find out his nephew was freed from the stain on which he seemed to compass around him, and shortly afterwards he showed his regard for his kinsman by giving him his blessing when he proposed for his daughter Trixie. Shortly after, he was made the junior partner in the banking firm.